All right, this is video number 4, and today's lecture we are talking about cultural interactions between Europeans, Native Americans, and Africans. This is topic 1.6 in the AP content and exam description. The theme that we're focusing on today is America in the world. And the learning objective is explain how and why European and Native American perspectives of others developed and changed in the period. So the first key concept is all about interactions between Europeans and Native Americans. We're looking at how they asserted divergent worldviews regarding issues such as religion, gender, and family, land use, and power. So natives in North America, they were extremely diverse and different from each other. As we said in the early lectures, there were over 2,000 different language groups in North America. But they all differed from Europeans in some significant ways. One of the most important is that all of them were not Christian. That was kind of the thing that put all of them into one category for the Spanish, is that all of them had different religious belief systems, and they were not really accepted by the Spanish solely because they were not Christian. Another main difference is that they did not place the same value on the same resources. So while natives in the New World would have had access to gold in some parts, they really didn't place as much value on it as the Europeans did. Instead, they had other natural resources that they used as currency or that they viewed as more valuable. On the top right here, you see a picture of a shell and little beads that are made out of that shell. So these are called wampums, and wampums were valuable. They were used as currency, especially in the Northeast. Tribes like the Iroquois used wampums to carry out transactions and trading. Some Native women also had more political power than their counterparts in Europe would have had. We've talked about how the Iroquois, they organized themselves along matrilineal lines, and the matriarch of a community would have power in choosing who the sachem, the leader, the chief of that community would have been. And then additionally, we have differences in the ownership of land, or perceptions of the ownership of land. While the Europeans had a very rigid perception of private property ownership, some tribes lived in communal areas, so they shared all of the land. They utilized it for agriculture, but that didn't really mean that they felt, or any one person felt, like they owned the land more than another person. And so these are going to be the things that are going to drive interactions between Native Americans and Europeans. So based on all those differences, there were bound to be misunderstandings. So mutual misunderstandings between Europeans and Native Americans often defined the early years of interaction and trade, as each group sought to make sense of the other. Over time, Europeans and Native Americans adopted some useful aspects of each other's culture. So let's talk about the first part of this key concept, the misunderstandings. Some of the most famous misunderstandings happened in the Aztec Empire with Moctezuma and Hernan Cortes. Moctezuma, who was the leader of the Aztecs, he famously misinterpreted the presence of the Spanish in Mexico as a fulfillment of an Aztec prophecy. So Moctezuma incorrectly believed that Hernan Cortes was the Aztec god Quetzalcoatl, and that's why he let the Spanish into Tenochtitlan. There was also misunderstandings on the side of the Europeans. So the Europeans, they saw gold, and they saw these new things in the New World, and they thought that there were going to be more. And sometimes they were setting off in these long, futile searches for things that did not exist. So think to things like the lost city of El Dorado. So this is the old gold city that has been abandoned. That was, a mythical place that was never found. And also the Fountain of Youth. The Spanish explorer Ponce de Leon traveled all across the Florida Peninsula in search of the Fountain of Youth, and he never found it. So the things that they gained from each other would have been horses and weapons on the sides of Native Americans. So the natives who established the friendly trade relations, they actually benefited from these European technologies and European horses. And once they traded for these weapons and traded for these horses, they were now able to use those resources against their old rivals. And so it really offset the balance of power in the New World from what it was previously. Europeans are able to establish sugar plantations in the New World, and they're also able to send back those crops that grow plentifully in the New World, or seeds for those crops, so that they can begin being grown in Europe. So that's the potato, squash, corn, beans, tomatoes. And the thing that really set off, or it increased the rate of this cultural exchange, is the intermarriage that the Spanish were doing within the Spanish Empire. Remember, the Spanish explorer were mostly men, and very few women came along. Very few family units came along, and so as the men were settling in the new Spanish Empire, they began to settle down and intermarry with the local populations. And then as you have those relations, cultural exchange begins to happen. So these people become the intermediaries for new technologies and new ways of thinking. All right, so European encroachments on Native Americans' land and demands on their labor increased. And so natives were not always too happy about this. So they sought to defend and maintain their political sovereignty, economic prosperity, religious beliefs, and concepts of gender relations through diplomatic negotiations and also military resistance. So this military resistance is something that we have to emphasize here, because the narrative so often becomes that the Spanish came over and that they completely destroyed Native American societies, and they succumbed because they were weaker. But in reality, there were some societies that were able to successfully stand up militarily against the Spanish. And this happened in modern day New Mexico. This at the time was the periphery of the Spanish New World Empire. The periphery means that it's the edges. And because it was so far to the northern edge, it was more difficult for the Spanish to maintain control in that area. So that's one of the things that helped the Pueblo people take back some sovereignty over their land. The main argument, or the main conflict that happened here, was that the Spanish were trying to limit religious rituals in the Pueblo area. So this is the area that goes as far north as Taos and as far south as the city of Santa Fe. They were trying to restrict the use of these Kachina idols. And so the Pueblo people banded together under Pope's rebellion, and they ousted the Spanish. They destroyed the Catholic churches that had been built in the area, and they were able to maintain control of their region for about 50 years before the Spanish came back. All right, extended contact with Native Americans and Africans fostered a debate among European religious and political leaders about how non-Europeans should be treated, as well as evolving religious, cultural, and racial justifications for the subjugation of Africans and Native Americans. So we talked about this debate in the last video between Bartolomé de las Casas and Juan Guinness de Sepulveda. De Sepulveda wanted to continue the encomienda system. He didn't see anything wrong with it, while Bartolomé de las Casas thought that it was inhumane, especially because Native Americans showed a willingness to convert, or at least the ones that he had encountered showed a willingness to convert to Catholicism, and so therefore he believed that they should not be enslaved, because that would be against the teachings of the Bible, that Christians should not enslave other Christians. In the end, the encomienda system comes to an end, but not without its replacement. So its replacement was the repartimiento system. And this was only a less stringent version of the encomienda system. It wasn't as harsh. Native Americans under the repartimiento system had a little bit more freedom, but there was still coerced labor that was taken from them in the repartimiento system. All right, and so as Spanish are not able to use enslaved native labor or coerced native labor, they had to look elsewhere, and so they start to look towards the Portuguese slave trade. The map on this slide shows the number of enslaved Africans that were brought to the New World across the entirety of the slave trade, and it totaled about 12.5 million people that were taken over. Now you see that the majority of them end up going to South America and to Brazil from West Central Africa. And a smaller number end up in Central America, the Caribbean, and then later on North America. But just because the number is so much greater in South America doesn't mean that the enslaved African labor that the Spanish were bringing in the 1500s wasn't large in scale, especially relative to the amount of Spanish that were in the Caribbean. So the Catholic Church opposed the enslavement of natives, and so because there was no ruling similar to that on enslaved Africans, they were able to continue the slave trade and with the West Indies. So the Caribbean is what the West Indies is what they used to call the Caribbean. Again, that name came from Columbus incorrectly thinking that he had landed in the East Indies, that he had made it all the way to Asia. All right, a quick recap here. Natives and Europeans differed greatly from one another. The continued contact in the New World led to a degree of cultural exchange. Natives pushed back in the interest of self-preservation. So your example there was the Pueblo people. And coerced labor sparked a moral and religious debate amongst Europeans. So you got to know the Las Casas and Sepulveda and the labor systems that they were fighting over. So it's the encomienda, repartimiento, and enslaved labor coming from Africa. All right, that is it for this set of notes. We only have one more set of notes in period 1, and I will see you then.